he's been here at the Vienna School of International Studies for quite a bit longer than me, actually. So he was the first Fulbright scholar here at the DA in 2001. It's a long, long time ago, and since then he has been teaching for us. And I'm looking there into the audience. There we have two other, one former Fulbright, one our current Fulbright scholar, Stuart Kaufmann and Nina Tannenwald. And Stuart, of course, has been teaching for us for many, many years now too. And Nina, I think you're the next one, I hope. So we're very happy about our American contingent here amongst our faculty. A few words about Richard and Richard's work. You can basically put it into three different categories. On the one hand, he's a fantastic scholar, and he's coined a couple of concepts, persistent engagement being one of them. Probably that's what he's best known for. Published widely on it. Last year there was a book appeared with Oxford University Press. So this is the one side, the scholarly one. Persistent engagement, so basically thinking about how deterrence works or doesn't work in cyberspace. Has, of course, also practical implications. So because of that, he's also very much involved in policy making. So in 2016, for instance, he was the first scholar in residence at the United States Cyber Command and the NSA. And the third important category of things that he really does a lot for his university. So he is professor of political science. He's director of the School of Public and International Affairs. He is co-director of the Ohio Cyber Range Institute, and he's the chair of the Center for Cyber Strategy and Policy at the University of Cincinnati. So there's really a lot happening there. A few things. So I'm gonna abuse this talk now a little bit to make advertisement for the school and also a project that Richard was involved in. And they are related, yeah. So as most of you know, so from next year onwards, there's going to be a whole new program, the DIA, Digital International Affairs Master. And we're very excited to do that. We do that together with the University of Innsbruck. But as usual with all of our programs, we're going to have really great faculty from the outside as well. And Richard, of course, is going to be one of them. And another one, so some time ago, Cornelia Biola and we did a conference, and Richard, of course, was part of that as well. And the book isn't out yet, but the cover is out there, so that I can show you. I think you haven't seen it. You haven't seen it yet either. So it is basically a quotation of a very famous painting, right? And thinking about that in cyberspace, the title is Digital International Relations, Technology, Agency, and Order. And the first substantive chapter is actually by Richard. When we talked about what he should talk about today, then Richard gave me lots of options, because obviously lots of ideas in his mind. And there was something on cybersecurity, which I'm sure would have been very, very interesting too. And then there was something on algorithmic agency, and that I thought was I was very, very interested in that, so I probably was a bit selfish, and I thought, let's go for the algorithmic agency. But this is really a very important question that really is totally cutting edge, right? Because so we all know politics does have to do with people and how they figure out what to do. But what happens actually if this figuring out what to do is influenced more and more by technology, yeah? What happens if it's more and more influenced by algorithms, by artificial intelligence and all of that, yeah? And we have a few hints in the literature sometimes so that something like that could happen or how that could happen in the future, but it's actually very, very, very vague, yeah? So this is why I'm very happy that you agreed to give this talk. So the full title is Algorithmic Agency and Cyber Persistence, the Birth of a New Species of Decision Maker. So Richard, first of all, I think we should give you a cordial welcome. And we're very much looking forward to your talk.
You got to give me my talk back.
Did I take your talk? Yeah. Okay, you'll get it back.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. So go ahead and we'll switch over here. So I'm going to use a little bit of visualization tonight, but before I get started, I just wanted to thank Markus directly for inviting me to give this talk, as he indicated, and it's frightening to realize that I possibly made a talk here at the DA before many in the audience were born. So, you know, he was kind not to say that I'm old, but just that I've been here a long time, right? It was very, very nice framing. I'm big into frames, so that was a good positive frame. I do want to just thank Ambassador Brix, who I got to speak with yesterday, and Deputy Director Schubert, and just the work that they're doing here and the expansion of the curriculum and this digital international relations program. Eventually, I'm going to argue, and I'll talk with Dr. Kornprobst about the idea that that adjective eventually will have to drop, right? Because at some point in time, we're not going to be able to conceive of international relations without it being digital, right? And so where and when that crossover occurs, we'll have to figure that out over time. I do want to acknowledge my two fellow Fulbrighters here. Thank you so much for coming tonight. When I first arrived, the directorship here was a former ambassador to the United Nations, Ernst Sukaripa, and I want to acknowledge Lily Sukaripa, who's a great friend. It's very nice for you to come tonight to hear this talk. And finally, to the audience, thank you so much. It's probably the nicest night of weather in Vienna in multiple weeks, and you're here spending this time with me. So I'm humbled by that. It's really nice to actually be talking about the virtual space with real live faces in front of me. So why don't we get started on that? So I just want you to take a look at this screen for a second. So none of those images, right, are actually humans, right? They were generated by a computer algorithm tasked with arranging millions of pixels so that they form images of humans, right? And then following some mathematical rules that required it to shift features, it rearranged those pixels. That's all that's happening there as I cued through that presentation, right? Rearrange those pixels to generate more and more images. And so this is a very simple example, but visual data placed in front of human beings can impact not only the way we think, but the way we feel, right? So you may have found one of those images familiar, right? I don't know which one of these might elicit an actual emotion, right? Might be familiar, and you might have a very positive view of that person, right? So I can actually get emotional reactions, and I'll come back to that as we go through this talk. So I'm going to switch over to a little PowerPoint slide here. And there we go. So I want to have a conversation with you, and I'm going to try to keep this tight so that we can engage in questions and answers. But I want to have a conversation about how do you frame the future that is already noticeably here, right? Like we kind of know where we're going in this, right? We have a discernible technology trend for which we have not developed, I would argue, either a policy or design principles that can anticipate the potential challenges that we're facing. Specifically, algorithmic-based decision-making across all sectors of society is going to become ubiquitous, right? So algorithmic-based decision-making across all sectors of society is going to become ubiquitous. And we have not framed the emergence of that trend properly. One of the challenges is not simply the generation of input data that appears real but is fake, but that these advancements are interconnected to a system of processing rules that are increasingly focused on each one of you at the individual level. In cyberspace, I'm collecting information about your behavioral and emotional preferences all the time. And through these generative computer programs that can prompt you to feel and maybe even act in a predictable way. Now, note, all input comes with some sort of context, right? So if I feed you a picture, an image, like I just did, kind of outside, you didn't know where I was going with that, and everything was kind of an odd experience, right? But typically, we're going to get most of our information set in some sort of familiar context. So you may have a digital platform that you expect news and information to come from. This is the site that I go to. And you'll receive that image as news initially. And the question becomes, if I've manipulated that information, how discerning can you be in that moment? And how reflective will you be? Right? So imagine right now you pick up your whatever app you use to see news, right? And this is what appears, right? You see an image and a headline, right? How does that make you feel? What's your first thoughts when you look at these pictures and see that headline, right? Now, one of the key questions is when you find out that those are fake, that those have been generated by algorithms, right? That the person pictured in this was not in the place that it depicts him to be, wasn't doing what it depicts him to be doing, right? Does that image actually stay in your mind? I'm sorry if you go to bed tonight with that image. I apologize, all right? But does it linger? Does it stay in your mind? And does it feed your general view of that person? It's a real person, right? I've put them in a place and in a situation that they never were, right? But does that image linger in our mental map? And if you have a positive view of that person, you're probably going to feel some degree of empathy right now. They really shouldn't have done that, right? Some people shouldn't make fake pictures of people. And if you had a negative orientation to this person, right, you're going to say, yeah, I could see him doing that, right? But in both cases, it becomes reinforcing potentially, right? So we have fake taken in context that might actually have lingering effect. Okay, this one's humorous, right? When we find out that it's fake, does that have an effect, right? Do you question the next picture that you're going to see, right? And how many fake pictures do I have to have cumulatively experienced before I start questioning everything that I see? What's that tipping point? Not really sure. But consider as well that this input creation that's behind these very sort of simply generated pictures is occurring in an interconnected global space with ease, at scale and scope, and very little barrier to their creation, right? It doesn't cost much to do this. And therefore, the ability to manipulate information to negative ends is growing significantly. Marcus referenced our book, Cyber Persistence Theory, and I'm not going to go down the cybersecurity route, but one of the core constructs in that book is that the nature of the space itself drives actors to seek exploitation of vulnerabilities that are inherent in the system. If you want more on that, we've got, I think, wine later, right? We can talk about that, right? But if you accept the notion that we're in this persistent environment in cyberspace in which manipulation of vulnerabilities is an inherent feature, and we have to assume that manipulation becomes regularized, the question becomes, can we take these very simple things and sustain behavior? Can we cause action and then sustain it? And we're not there totally yet, but we are seeing signs about what could happen. So this actually happened 3 days ago, right? So a tweet on a blue-checked site called Bloomberg Feed that looked like Bloomberg News tweeted an image, and it said it was the US Pentagon under an attack. It was picked up by a financial-oriented website that has 336,000 followers in about 2 minutes. 2 minutes later, it was retweeted to an account that had over 700,000 followers, also a financially oriented account. And so within those first 4 minutes, about a combination of sites that were well over 1 million followers. And the US stock market drops in that 4th minute 85 points. That's what that graph shows you right there. So, it was declining a little bit, and then you get this trough. Right? Now, I can't tell you that this was causal, but at least there's some correlative data there that suggests that something was going on. Right? There are some accounts that are automated that if there is some sort of disaster, right, it kicks in and sells. Right? Now, it recovered relatively quickly, but it gives you some little sense, right, of how interconnected we are in this space. By the way, Russia Today picked it up 2 minutes later, and in their English version, Twitter account, which has about 3 million followers, sent out reinforcing that the U.S. Pentagon was under attack.
So how quickly was it caught?
Yeah, so 26 minutes after that first tweet, the agency that's responsible for Pentagon security tweeted out that this was fake. Now, they may have been sending out, I just did this examination on Twitter, right? There's other, obviously, social media sites, but this is the data that I was able to collect. It only happened 3 days ago, so I'm working fast here. Right? I'm trying to keep up, make it as relevant as I can, Marcus, right, to the times. The only thing about that, Nina, though, that site has 27,000 followers, right? So the Pentagon, emergency site, most Pentagon officials don't actually follow, right, because there's about 1 million people that are associated with the Department of Defense. So just a little side note on that. The basic issue, though, that I'm trying to bring up here, right, is that information generation through algorithms is a significant challenge, right? And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. And it raises big questions about truth and management of truth. But what I'm here to tell you is that only scratches the surface, right? And what I want to suggest to you, as the title implies, we've got a much, much bigger context that we have to deal with. Right. To date, we have primarily looked at this as growing sophistication of processes and sets of rules followed by computation, what people call AI or artificial intelligence. But we've been doing that without thinking through what the expansion of this capacity to observe, orient, decide, and potentially act at great speed and across great scale and scope of data, what that means, not as a tool of decision making, not as a basic application that I buy and I put into a computer and let it run, right? But actually to think about this as a new form of decision maker, what I call the algorithmic agent. The rise of algorithmic agency will be a major discontinuity with the past, and it'll have profound impacts that are going to be both positive and negative. Change is not necessarily either, right? It can go both ways. But it's coming, and it's coming at scale. And we've been here before, right? So if you consider my home institution, University of Cincinnati, it was started in 1819. We're the 18th oldest university in the United States. 1819, the labor force in the United States, 72% was in agriculture. Right? 72% of the entire labor force in the United States was associated with agriculture. And the United States made up about 2% of the world economy. In 2019, when we celebrated our bicentennial at the university, less than 2% of the US labor force was associated with agriculture. And the United States is the world's largest economy. Now imagine if we were actually in 1819 and Markus had invited me to give a lecture about sort of the future of technology and society, and I suggested to you, right, that there would be no more farming, no more farmers, not farming, farmers, right, in the foreseeable future. Like the entire labor force will be decimated, and the United States will expand and explode as a dominant economic power. You're probably kicking me out of that room, right? And so what I would ask, as I now suggest some predictions, which were always dangerous, that you stay with me and don't kick me out of this room, right? At least not until the reception's over and I get at least a glass of wine out of this, all right? So what I will predict is that as algorithmic agency emerges, that we are going to have a major readjustment in work and labor. Right? There are going to be huge swaths of professions that are fairly significant in today's economy that will either disappear or become very minor in the overall production of wealth. But I'll give you at least one positive prediction, and that is if we actually think this through and we actually adjust in this early phase of this well, we're all going to live longer, and we're going to be much healthier. Right? Algorithmic agents are going to have a profound effect on health. We'll come back to that later. I wanted to give you at least something positive to think about. Right? All right. So the industrial age, right, was not the first major discontinuity, of course, in human history. It's been defined by huge breaks before. One of my concerns, and one of the things that I'd want to talk about during Q&A, is there does, though, seem, when we look back historically, that these breaks had some sort of, if you will, absorption rate that was reasonable, right? That there was time to absorb, that the change occurred over a manageable period of time. Doesn't mean that there wasn't massive dislocation, right? Doesn't mean that there wasn't harm. Doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of opportunity. But we do have a sense of sort of speed, right? And it's one of the things that's associated with cyberspace and the architecture, right? And so I don't think, are we managing this speed aspect really well? And I don't think so, right? And we partly, and I think major-wise, because we haven't landed holistically on what this change is and where we want this change to go. I'm going to argue to you that the frame is decision-making roles and responsibilities, right? And that's what I mean by introducing this concept of algorithmic agent, right? When you think about an agent, I don't want you to think about an application. I don't want you to think about a piece of computer code. I want you to think about not buying code, but hiring a decision maker. Right? And in that frame, what is the parameters of agency? Who has it and who doesn't? Right? That's what this kind of concentration of concept, if you will, I think shifts us to. So what most people acknowledge is that what's happening is some sort of fusion of software, hardware, and enormous data, right? So this is the piece of this Venn diagram, right? That, or Venn diagram, might be Zen, but that really makes the difference, right? So we've had software, we've had hardware, we've had the processes that interconnect, but there's been a limitation in computational form and function about how much data, right, and what form of data needs to be fed to this software and hardware. And we're now getting past the post on this, right? That big data sets are going to be able to be managed. Sophisticated algorithms that through what we call deep learning are generative of their own training environment. They can organize data that's unlabeled, right? It's not presented to them in simple format by human, but rather just dumped, right? And scraped and absorbed. And so therefore, that's where this scale comes in, right? It becomes massive. And so what I would argue to you is that this is creating a fundamental opportunity to utterly rethink the overall OODA loop. Generally, as humans, we OODA loop all the time, right? We observe, we orient, we decide, and we act. And then we observe what those actions have led to, and we orient to that new situation, decide, and act again. We're continuously doing this. We're going to be creating algorithms that can do these functions at a data input level that it may take most humans their entire lives to experience. And in some cases, maybe actually incapable of experiencing what these algorithms can actually pull in from a data standpoint. And we're going to tie that data collection into a computational capacity that can organize that input at remarkable speed. So therefore, we're going to be able to outperform humans under certain conditions of going through this loop. And here's the crux of my argument to you tonight and to start this conversation. Regarding AI, we need to shift from thinking, as I said, about coding process and think about creating, where in fact what we're doing is there's a birthing process going on right now. We are heading towards creating a new species of decision maker on this planet. And how we relate to it needs to be determined. From what types of decisions will humans move out of the loop? remain principally in the loop, and what will be decided on the loop? An actual merged role and responsibility between the algorithmic agent and the human. Currently, the evolution of algorithmic agents and their agency is being driven primarily by the private sector and their research and development in market. This is very different than the industrial age, right? When we built stuff, we built it, figured out how it worked, actually wrote instructions, told people this is the proper way to use it, and then went to market with it. We're doing research and development primarily with regard to this algorithmic agency in market. These are being grown actually through your activity. It's how you use the apps that you have on your digital devices, right? But we're doing this without consideration of these larger issues, particularly how they might accumulate up to national level and even national security implications. So let me give you, a simple example that we're all experiencing. Right now, most of us hand off directional sense, right, to the GPS application that's on our phones. Right? And in short time, we're seeing that we're tying this to modes of transportation. Right? We're going to tie that GPS to our cars. Right? This tends to get presented to us as autonomous vehicles or something like that. I want you to think about them as chauffeured vehicles. Right? Algorithmic agent, the agent is chauffeuring you around. Right? Who doesn't want to be chauffeured? Right? We're going to get to that fairly quickly. But there's no policy in place right now at the systemic level that says these are the parameters of safety and security about moving people across our country. Right? Even though we're actually introducing a different form of moving people through and around our country. Right? Just as an aside, I coach a high school women's soccer team, 14 to 18-year-olds. Not one of them, now, if they're watching the stream, they'll come back to me. But they don't have any cognitive sense of east, west, south, and north. Right? I mean, it's just, now their response is, why do I need to know that? I've got my GPS, right? So we can hand off to these agents, right, different functionalities and create space in our neurons to do other things. So these AAs, as I call them, right, this would be a challenge if we lived in a benign world. But since I wake up every morning, as Professor Kornprobst suggested, and I worry about security, and I worry about malign activity, right, we don't live in a purely benign world. And so I have to think through, when you set this up as a system of transportation, right, what bad things can happen? How do I disrupt the traffic algorithm that's driving this system? I can disrupt supply chains, which have significant economic effects, right? If I want to actually deal with an adversary in a different kind of way, just making that system inefficient. I'm not talking about blowing up transportations, right? That's pretty obvious. But if I can mess with that algorithm a little bit, right, its input or its actual calculations, and reintroduce inefficiencies in a system that's not tolerant of inefficiency anymore, I can have economic effect. There was a German artist, I think about 2 years ago. He wanted to test this thesis out of just playing around with how input impacts action. So he bought 100 flip phones, right? Put them on the same GPS, and he put it in a little red wagon, and he walked across a bridge, right? And Google Maps rerouted all the traffic heading towards that bridge away from the bridge because it thought that there was 100-car pileup moving very, very slowly across this bridge, right? Now, clever, made the point, right? That was pretty simple manipulation. Right? As we become more and more dependent on these systems, where the resiliency in our own reflective, again, no one looked, and there were people, there's some video of this, there were people that could see there was nobody on the bridge, and yet they turned off, right? Because why? Because the GPS said, turn right, right? You've handed over, even though you're still at the wheel, you've handed off a good bit of agency. So ultimately, it comes down to this. We have to determine the relationship between us as humans, human decision makers, and algorithmic agents. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are 3 core policy questions that we have to figure out. Under what conditions will I give the algorithmic agent an advisory role? Right? When does the human remain on the loop, in the loop and uses the AA to just sort out best options? What's the conditionality that leads me to that relationship? Right? Second, under what conditions do I give the algorithmic agent actual decision-making control? Right? That the AA is in the loop and the human is out of the loop. Chauffeured vehicles are going to be an example of that. Right? I'm going to hand over the agency of getting me from point A to point B completely to an algorithm. And then, really challenging, under what conditions do I fuse the human with the algorithmic agent so that the decisions are human, but not so much? Right? One of the key challenges in practice of medicine, for example, has been interpreting people's ailments based on the information that we as patients provide. Bottom line is, we're really bad at telling doctors, right, what's our problem. And doctors have to be really good interpreters, right, at telling what we're telling them about how we feel and figure out what to do next. And what they do is they assess patterns, right? If they're very experienced as medical providers, they assess patterns that they have seen before in those descriptions, right? My stomach hurts. And chooses a general path that has worked for most people, right? I mean, that's the basic, when you strip it down, the interaction that's going on between doctor and patient. And then the doctor will go to try to either verify where they think the diagnosis should be, or if they're unclear, we'll get more tests, right? And we run these tests that give doctors more precise information, which they then interpret, and based on their experience and the information, the limited information that they've had time to read about in their careers, they will make a final judgment. All of this is based on generalizing my symptoms against a general common good diagnosis. Right? Well, now imagine we're going to be presented with another option, right? To wear a sensor that tracks my body daily and quickly learns what's normal for me, right? So there's lots of patterns to humans, but there's a lot of differentiation, right? Particularly at the ailment, individual ailment level. So it's going to be able to tailor down to my individual physiology. And it will be able to detect instantly when a pathogen enters my body that my body's not well suited to deal with. Pathogens are attacking us all the time. And most of the time, our body's very, very resilient to it. But each one of us has different resiliencies to different kinds of pathogens, right? And so it's going to be able to figure out and immediately notify me the best course of action based on reading thousands and thousands of research papers on the specific subject and having access to real case histories associated with pathogen, this particular pathogen, and this particular immune system that's vulnerable to it. Why wouldn't I wear that sensor? Right? I could still ignore it. I could say, well, I'm not going to do what it tells me, right? But medical care is going to be utterly transformed. In that instance, I'm still in the loop, right? but I'm really, really empowered by an incredibly powerful advisor. But what's the condition under which you're going to go and see that human doctor to verify, or are you just going to bypass it? Right? But what if I offered you a sensor that you could implant in your body, just swallow it, little pill, right? And that could not only monitor your physiology, but it would be able to look at your metabolic rate and understand what's your ideal diet. How many carbs, protein, and fat should you eat every day, right? To have the ideal weight. And we know, right, in human society, that having weight that's not appropriate to our physiology has whole bunches of disease implications, right? Impacts us in terms of our overall ability to stay on this planet, right? So what if it could monitor that, but also impact the neurological pathways that impact my desires to eat, right? And so as you go through the day, if you're having a bit too many carbs, it actually depresses the bioneurological sensors that make you desirous to carbs, right? And therefore you don't overeat carbs that day. In fact, as part of this massive, unbelievable system that is called the human body, we've now amplified it, right, with a data collection and sensing system that makes us really, really good at consuming the energy sources that we need. And so I choose what to eat, but not entirely, right? So I can have a different eating pattern in a day. I can have different foods coming into me, but you're not going to have a different eating pattern, right? The impact on health will be amazing, right? And these sensors are being tested right now. Ultimately, the algorithm's going to be able to observe, orient, decide, and act with more information than humans can process, and in theory, make better informed decisions. The question is, back to my 3 policy questions, is that sufficient to hand over decision authority? Is that the conditionality, right? When I can present you with an algorithm agent that can make better informed decisions than I can as a human? I don't know. I'm waiting to hear from you, right? But one thing I know is that we do retain sort of an interesting combination of being curious. That's what drives humans, ultimately, right? We're really curious species, right? We question things, and we seek answers. But the other thing that distinguishes us is the ability to reflect on that curiosity, right? And that capacity to reflect deeply and ponder choice, while not always efficient and not maximally rational, is what has defined us as a species and as we've developed, right? It's who we are. We are really good, limited, emotionally affected, imperfect decision makers who basically satisfies our way through life, right? We find good outcomes, not the maximum outcome, not the rationally at maximum outcome, right? The satisfactory outcome, and move on. But we're going to be joined fairly soon, right, with a decision maker who's going to be really good, is going to also be a really good decision maker, but they're going to be unemotional and unlimited processors who can come closer to maximizing benefit out of whatever choice problem set that you have. There's going to be great incentive to move to a society that relies on better decision making. Right? I mean, why wouldn't we want better decision making? How we line it up, though, is really still up to us. we retain that reflection capacity, and I would argue we haven't been doing enough reflection, right? And that's part of the point of this talk, right? We are birthing these algorithmic agents and creating the potential for a fundamental discontinuity in the mid-21st century in how society is going to be organized. But we can decide what roles we want these agents to play, and we have to decide to be curious about the possible, but also reflective about the desirable. And ultimately, it's that combination that I would ask you to be. Be reflective, or be curious and be reflective. Elliot is my cat. This is not Photoshop. This is not a fake picture. Elliot is a cat. He's curious. He's not reflective at all. I got an important meeting that's just about to start, right? And he's too interested about chasing my cursor, right? So I love him, but don't be Elliot, right? And so let's think about this a little bit more deeply and reflect on it. And Markus, let's open up the floor.
So, Richard, thank you very, very much. Still have to put this thing back up because I was distracted by Elliot. So, there are lots of questions that can come to our minds there, yeah? Some probably more societal, some more political, and I anticipate quite a few of them, so I'm probably going to bundle always 3 at a time. So who wants to get started? Yes, please.
If I could take advantage of having the
Oh,
mic.
sorry. Yes.
That's why you volunteered.
Do I volunteer?
It's an optimizer, not a satisfier.
That was optimizing.
I had initially wanted to ask a question about digital deterrence, but since Professor Kornprobst was so selfish to pick a different topic, I'm going to shift here a little bit.
We can do that at the reception.
Yeah. So, listening to your presentation, I'm going to pull from a class I took with Professor Tannenwald back in 2003 when the global war on terror broke out, and the U.S. started fighting all over the world. They started compiling more and more information via drones, and they started developing Project Maven to try and compile this facial recognition software, basically. And as I'm listening to your presentation and I hear you talk about an unemotional, unlimited decision maker, I think that's probably one of the worst things you want to have when making firing decisions, supporting the warfighter downrange. And as these decision makers at the top ranks are compiling all this data, you want to have emotion in it. So how concerned are you about humans coming out of the loop in warfighting and autonomous weapons? Is that a concern? Is that overblown? What are your thoughts on that?
Brian, thanks a lot. I think then we're gonna move there. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. My name is Chiara Graziani. I'm a second-year student here at the Diplomatic Academy. And my question pertains to legislative or regulatory frameworks to govern algorithmic agency. I mean, you've mentioned that it seems as if we've not been able to anticipate what was happening or what is happening right now in terms of algorithmic agency, and you've also mentioned what you believe are key policy questions for the future. But could you maybe elaborate on whether there are discussions on such frameworks going on right now in the US, but maybe also here in the EU, and whether there are also different approaches in terms of how to address these new challenges here in Europe and in the US? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. And then I think there was someone, Ben, and then next round, I promise.
So thank you very much, Professor, for your very insightful talk. I have a question pertaining to the proliferation of AI agency as a self-enforcing cycle. With the very simple, arguably simple, publicly available AI tools, we already see that the most effective way to detect AI also AI mistakes, is to use another AI. So with the inevitable proliferation of AI as becoming a more involved agent in decision-making, also in politics, isn't it inevitable that we will at some point require a sort of AI police that is itself an AI? And what does that say about a potential self-enforcing cycle of AI agency? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So,
Yeah,
which I'm going to hand over to you. There are
Great
three
questions.
very easy
I'll try
questions.
to be succinct. So I'm actually really concerned about autonomous weaponry, right? And I actually fully concur with you that emotion is important, right? Now, you can train parameters so that, in fact, if you will, artificially emotional content, that is, one of the measures that I'm measuring the particular environment against is an empathy variable, right, or something like that. But what's interesting is if you look at most conversations about autonomous weaponry, it's not being driven by militaries, right? Militaries are the most hesitant about going this route, right? So that being said, easier said than done to stop this, right? Because we're going to face a situation where I say to you, okay, well, look, we're putting people in harm's way for logistical purposes, right? So why not use a chauffeured truck, right, to carry logistics, right? And to your point, Benedict, the idea that if I start relying on an agent, wouldn't I produce an agent to counter the agent, right, and counter that agency? So I'm going to try to have the sensors on my drones understand, well, actually, these vehicles don't have humans in them. Does that actually increase my incentive, or put it another way, decrease the disincentive? I don't have as much hesitancy to blow them up, right? I'm not concerned because I'm not taking out any humans, right? So I've taken that out of the decision. So does that actually make the intensification of the application of force even more intense, right? So these are the types of secondary and tertiary effects that we have to think about. There'll be an intensity, so if you think about the logic train that I just threw out, right? We could save lives, and in the effort to save lives, we actually intensify warfight. Is that where we want to be, right? If you think back to, where everybody goes, and I hate to bring this imagery up, but it's already in your head, right? Terminator, Skynet, right? All type of things. And the whole point of that was, well, why would I want an emotional finger on the button? Does that lead to error, right? A certain percentage possibility, right? But on the other side of this is, again, can I capture empathy? Can I capture that moment in which there is a decision maker who's willing to engage in lots of death and destruction, but not entire death and destruction? And is there, how do I train the algorithmic agent to do that? So we're not there, we're very far away, but my concern is, just as we're seeing in the marketplace, the introduction of research and development in market, once you have first mover types of efforts in this, does that produce the counter agent? So let me take that third self-enforcing type of thing. Yeah, right? So to live in a society 5.0 that elevates the roles and responsibilities of algorithmic agents, some of their agency is going to be to monitor and manage what other algorithmic agents are doing, right? And so when we think about this from a regulatory standpoint, I would want, again, to move this conversation away from thinking about it as regulating tech, right? And actually move it into the Department of Labor conversation of what is the workplace environment that I'm creating for these agents? What's their role? What's their responsibility, right? So when I think about this from an organizational standpoint, right, it's not about regulating their capacity, it's regulating how I use that capacity, right? Is it advisory? Is it decision-making? Is it fused? So that's where I think this conversation has to move to, because we've been sort of stuck, particularly on cybersecurity. Everybody knows this is an insecure environment. And you ask, well, why aren't we moving? Why aren't there legislative, regulatory actions being taken, right? Now, one, it's that we've actually we've absorbed a myth, what I call the fallacy of fragility, right? The big tech, information technology as a sector, has basically been able to propagate the myth that there's something very unique about information technology that if we put any sort of parameters on it, it's just going to die. Innovation's going to die, right? Innovation doesn't die in any other sector of the economy that has parameters known as regulations, right? The students in my class have heard this, but you know, there's more safety regulations on your refrigerator than on your operating system. Now, last time I checked, people still buy refrigerators, right? There's a market for refrigerators. There's suppliers of refrigerators. What did they do? They just adjusted to a market that everybody else had to play in. So the question that we can't actually move towards greater safety and security, I'm in the camp that suggests that you can if you had the political will to do it and that the market would adjust. But I'd like to actually remove us from that conversation, right? And actually move this into a labor conversation. What's the role and what's the responsibility that you're going to have these agents engage in? It just frames it fundamentally differently, right? And interestingly, to your question, it leads to different government agencies being involved that typically we wouldn't have thought about, right? Being involved in conversations about tech development.
Thank you. And I'm going to do the next round of three. Maybe let's do 1, 2, 3.
Thanks very much. So far, you've talked mostly in terms of national regulation and national picture, but with deep fakes and AI being used to interfere with elections like it was recently in Turkey and arguably in our 2016 presidential election, what can be done on the international level? So like we have Geneva Conventions about conduct of war and humanitarian affairs. It seems to me, although it seems also very impossible, but maybe possible, how can we start to regulate this, at least in terms of broad strokes, on an international basis? Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much for a very interesting presentation. I would return back to this decision makers, and once when the algorithms take the main role as the decision makers, if that happens, do you think that they should, in a kind, incorporate still some human values, preferences, some kind of emotions? And how we do that? And secondly, what do you think about some of the opinions in the different articles that say that this could lead to maybe more rational, but also too rational world, and how that world would look like? Thank you.
Thank you. And then Stuart, Professor Kaufmann in the back.
Thank you, Richard. I thought that was a great talk. I have really diligently worked to avoid grappling with this set of issues, so I'd like to thank you for not only bursting my bubble, but for scaring the crap out of me in doing so.
You're welcome.
When I reflect on all of this, what I get stuck on is the problem that's already urgent, that all of this makes more urgent, which is the quality of the information that's coming in on which the decision maker is acting whether the decision maker is an autonomous, artificial intelligence or human, right? If you fiddle with the GPS data that's coming to the truck, that truck is going to get lost or go the wrong way, whether it's autonomously piloted or whether there's a person there if they're relying on the GPS. So my question is, what kinds of ideas do you have on how to make it either more difficult to propagate false information, or at least to identify it and filter it out? As we know, right now we've got people, individual people, going down rabbit holes of different kinds of conspiracy theories and all that kind of stuff. So obviously there's this political dimension, but there's also the more kind of routine dimension as well. So.
Sia, thanks a lot. Richard.
Yeah, great set of questions. I'll try to tie some of these together. Let me start with the values issue, because it ties a bit to the quality of information issue, and then I'll bring it back to the international level. So there's a real so it's not about excluding values. The training data actually can be very reflective of values, right? We've got some bad examples of what happens when Microsoft released its first chatbot. I think it was Trinity, and a whole bunch of folks on Reddit decided, well, let's feed it really malignant data, right? Kind of racist and misogynist type of it, and this thing just went really bad, right? Microsoft had to pull it because it was learning and reflective of the data that was, Now, you can't say that the chatbot itself was racist. It just became trained only on that, right? There's early case of some of the stuff that was happening in London. Google DeepMind was based there. And they were doing some very early voice recognition stuff. And it was for security purposes. So, they recognize the tone of your voice, and this would let you into a lab. And so they trained it. It was very good. It was very effective. And they had a visiting woman professor. She went up, and she was authorized in the system. Door wouldn't open. Why? Because they had never trained it on a woman's voice, right? It's a whole bunch of male computer scientists, right? Never thought about that, right? So there's a whole bunch of problem with the data bias, right, in the early training models that we've seen. And so early machine learning was based on tagged data. And what you're seeing now with this language processing, large language processing, things like ChatGPT and things of this nature, we're now moving to an untagged, an unfiltered data set, right? So that the training, if you will, of these algorithms, the machine learning that's occurring across these deep neural nets, can be more expansive. So the question becomes, do you just let it go and replicate humankind, right? This is the market of ideas idea, right? And that generally speaking, we're decent people, right? We're social, we're not, but there's a lot of malignant stuff out there. So then wouldn't there be incentive to actually, and this is getting to your point, Alexandra, right? Bias the training towards the better part of our angels, right? Or however that phrase goes, right? Now, the question is who gets to decide, right, on what is, valued, right? Positive, benign, value system training data. The problem is not this stuff actually becoming very effective at decision making. It is, what are you actually educating it on? So I would, again, like terms of terminology, get away from the idea of training. I train code. I educate, my teenagers. You've got kids.
Yes.
Sometimes we do it well.
Sometimes we don't.
Right? And sometimes we do it well and they still, right, go in a different direction than we want them to. So we're going to have to be educating these agents, right? And there's these big, I mean, this is a fundamental question, right? They are going to learn what we teach them, right? Again, this is why I want to put this in an agency frame rather than in a code frame. And if the question then comes down to, that quality of information. So the interesting thing, Stuart, that I've been pondering about is, and what I didn't get into because I didn't really want to, scare you tonight, right? But how many of you remember, saw this movie, Forrest Gump? Still? Okay, that's nice, right? So how many of you cried at that movie at some point in time? Come on, more hands. You all cried, right? So I walked out of that movie. I don't remember when it occurred, but it was a long time ago. Remember, I'm old, right? I walked out of that movie, and my wife, tears are flowing, from her, and I'm freaking out. And she's like, "What's wrong with you?" Right? Didn't you like the movie? And I'm like, Did you see? They put him with Nixon. He was never with Nixon. People are going to believe that he was with Nixon. Remember, that was that famous scene where it was him, Elvis, and Nixon, right? We believe what we see, right? And if we can start to manipulate history in a real conscious way, well, I'm now going to be able to put you, Stuart, in a place that you never were, and it's not going to be those pictures, right? But I'm going to be able to have your voice, right, and your mannerisms. It's going to be seamless, right? So I'm going to be able to have you say something you never said, and be in a place that you never were, and do something that you never did.
Just don't put me in a sex tape.
Well, I wasn't even going there, right? So the question becomes, seriously, we have the capability to do that. And 2024, when you've got a British election and an American election going, it's going to be a field day in trying to manage this. And that's why I asked you that question about the Pope picture, right? Kind of a benign picture. It was kind of funny. You could actually look at it. I mean, there were sort of fashion influencers that thought it was real, and they're like, whoa, and they started passing this around until, people said, no, it wasn't real. That was kind of fun and benign. But when do we hit that curve, right, in which truth manipulation becomes the assumption, and we become a nerd to it? Well, that might actually have a positive effect when I put Stuart in a place that he never was, doing something he never did, saying something he never was. I'm going to actually be skeptical about that, right? And this is why I suggest to you that it's about reflection, right? So I don't think there's a technical fix to that. Well, I have a technical idea, right? But there's no technical fix. It's up here, right? It's going to be how reflective, right, are we when we see information that may be a bit problematic. But there's stenography and issues that I can do with on video, and there's some technical fixes. But ultimately, we have this, and in most Western liberal democracies, this default that you're innocent until proven guilty, right? Are we going to have to get to individual monitoring levels so that you can actually show me some empirical evidence to suggest that you were never where that video was taken at that time? Now we're back to my sensors, right, that are constantly monitoring you, right? People's minds go to Orwell because the state can get access to that information. Look, the market already does, okay? Google or Apple know where you are right now, right? Unless you've turned off a whole bunch of features of default on those things that my generation still calls phones, right, or mini computers. And there's a generation in here that doesn't actually pick them up and talk to them, right? That's absurd. But they know where you are, right? And you're kind of comfortable with that because it makes life convenient and stuff like that. So how much of that defense of knowing where I am is going to be? So we got to worry about the bias in the data and figure out how to train it, but recognize that the propagation of false information is here to stay, right? And so we're going to have to try to find some empirical, algorithmic capacity to discern manufactured stuff, and there's going to be a battle about that. And we're probably going to have to play some sort of role in self-surveillance. That sounds really, really crazy, right? This is Orwell turned on his head, right? That in fact, the way to retain individual agency is actually to monitor ourselves 24 hours a day. Okay, so where's the international component of this come in? First, it comes into the structure of the space itself. So you're absolutely correct. While we are all looking at this from a national level, you live in an interconnected space. It's not a segmented space. So it is a global interconnected place of activity, right? Like I said, 6 minutes into that Pentagon tweet, Russia Today has already tweeted that out, right, to its 3 million global users that are just English speakers, right? So the propagation of this, again, is a global phenomenon. Where is the global agency to manage this? There is none, right? So at the technical level, it sits actually in these very, very important fora that nobody pays attention to that set technical standards, right? So the IT community is functioning every day as an epistemic community, and in fact as an international organizational capacity, something that from a digital IR standpoint, we got to spend a lot more time thinking through, right? Because the technology does need to be managed, right? And the experts are managing it, but who's managing the experts right now is unclear, because most policymakers don't understand the tech, right? So when you understand that kind of dilemma, we then have to think through, back to your question about sort of regulation, how do the other sort of key, now I'm crossing over to digital IR, but the other key relationship that we have to think about in this space is between corporate digital powers, right, and the state. And so this is manifested, you know, if you look at the Ukraine-Russian war, right? There's a corporate power, corporate cyber power, that makes a decision very, very quickly in that war that was fundamental in Ukraine still having the capacity to fight this war a year out. Starlink, right? It's a satellite-based communication system that's owned by, anybody? Elon Musk, right? And so when you boil this down, Starlink is actually, if I put it in political science terms, right, an authoritarian actor, right? And I don't mean that in a negative way, no aspersions to Mr. Musk, but he's a single decision maker, right? He woke up and decided, this was really nasty that the Russians did this to the Ukrainians. I'm going to give the Ukrainians access to Starlink. And that has had an operational impact in the fighting of a war. That's the province of states, right, Marcus? I mean, when we think about international relations and conflict, we're thinking state and state province. But Ukraine is not standing unless Elon Musk made that decision. Now, in an international relations context, we tend to, as states, if somebody's going to affect war, what do? Well, we send our diplomats out to talk to them, say, hey, you got capacity that could help me advance my interests if we're in a war, right? And so we should align with each other, right? We should figure out what would happen if a war breaks out, where you're going to line up, right? They're called alliances, and we signed treaties with them. There was no pre-agreement with Starlink to provide that provision that has been decisive on the battlefield. And if Elon Musk, as an authoritarian, decides tomorrow that he doesn't want to do it, he can. He's threatened to do this. He asked the Pentagon to start paying for this, right? Because he's paying for it. Well, this was the easy call, right? Because Starlink didn't have any economic exposure in Russia, right? And there was this sort of moral outrage initially, right? The next conflict in international relations, right, not going to be so easy. Where corporate digital powers line up in a space in which maybe they share a market with 1 billion people and 330 million people. One's called China, one's called the United States, right? Now you got economic exposure in both places, pretty tough at an economic level. And if one of those two powers got into a militarized crisis and they were a little bit more savvy about their information, things of this nature, does that make that corporate decision more difficult? What's neutrality in this space? I know Austria, right? It's nice to be neutral, right? But you're in interconnected space. Neutrality is all about segmented space, right? So how are you managing this interconnected space on your own? You're not, right? You're actually at the, if you will, being affected by lots of other decisions. So I'm not trying to be evasive to the question. Traditional international mechanisms that are based on a principle of segmentation, territoriality, national sovereignty, are ill-suited for the generation of where we're going and why we do need that adjective in front of international relations right now, right? Because we don't understand and we haven't prepared what digital international relations is going to be from a legal standpoint, from an international organization standpoint, from a player standpoint, i.e. corporate, right, and the others.
Thank you, Richard. One round of questions. Just hands up very quickly.
I'll try to be quick so we get to drinks.
Who's the one to ask? 1, 2, 3. That's perfect. So then, Brian, you choose.
Okay. Start farthest away.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. And I'm a bit scared now as well. The questions that I had previously, they've mostly been answered, but I'm still interested on your opinion regarding on that we shouldn't be regulating tech, but creating the environment, right, for the AI agents. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. And in your opinion, what's the best scenario? Like, what's the best outcome? Is it national governments, NGOs, IOs, the private sector, or is it a mix? Like, how do you see it for the future? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we had one question like there. Oh, the gentleman, yes.
Okay. My name is Christian Umfeld. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you also for just mentioning aerospace, which is what I mainly do for most of the time. But my question is a different one. I wanted to throw in one additional term into this discussion about how to train the agents, which is trust. And trust, basically in terms of, I was wondering, we're all talking about how to regulate the agents and the way they are trained and the information that they get. How do we get the agents to negotiate that among each other? So how do we get the agents to become reflective? How do we get the agents to develop some kind of ethics, some kind of ethical standard, and to establish trust among them, each other, in order to determine which information to receive from which source and which information to consider trustful or not?
Definitely a very good question. Thank you. And yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. My name is Shayan Rabi. I'm a second-year student here at the DA. You mentioned earlier that the nature of work and the composition of the labor force will be drastically shifted in the coming years, with AI agents increasingly taking over routine tasks that humans used to perform. My question is, how can we, as a society, address the resulting deep economic inequalities between, on the one hand, the people or the organizations who own these technologies and profit greatly from them, and on the other hand, the rest of society? For example, perhaps the introduction of a universal basic income. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, big question
One more
right
time.
at the end. Okay. Let's take them. Let me start with the trust issue, because that's absolutely essential. So again, in terms of what we educate these agents on, there's no barrier mathematically or computationally to an ethical component, right? So the parameters that need to be set can be set against an ethical standard, right? What right now the tech has difficulty being able to do is interrogate the algorithm, right? So if the algorithm does something slightly unexpected, is it just simply the limitation of the human designer? We didn't anticipate it, so that's why it's a surprise. Or is it actually novel, right? And we don't have a really good sense of what that is. So when Google DeepMind, it was, I guess, 2017, had the Go moment, right? So it was playing against Go is the Asian version of chess, much more complex, right? Makes a move, I think it was the 25th move or somewhere around that in the game, no one had ever seen before. It was like weird. It was like, totally stumped the world champion, right? He actually got up and he walked out and he came back and he started playing thinking that, well, this thing made a mistake, right? Because this is just a really strange move. And as it turned out, he had lost the game on that 25th move, right? That move just ended the game. It set the parameters, right? And, big questions about, like, where did that come from? And the problem is we can't ask the algorithm, right? And there's this inherent challenge that we have right now, or not, in terms of computer science in particular, is that there's still a tension between safety and security. So when you actually educate these agents, right, the algorithm, we may want to say, okay, it's doing something that we didn't anticipate, we're going to shut it down, right? Now, when you talk about code, that sounds okay. If you keep up my concept of agents, then you're actually killing it, right? And that becomes interesting, right? Because if you use that and you're killing an algorithm, do we have an emotional reaction to that? I don't know, right? But if I have a kill switch in the algorithm so that I can reset it and put it back to, again, don't think about your teenager here, Marcus, right? But if you could go back to like 5 years old and they were, let's do this again, right? We'll do it again. The problem is that introduces safety into this algorithm and also introduces insecurity, right? Because if I can get in and reset, then that means there's a door there somewhere that somebody who might want to manipulate can actually get in there too. So what I do for safety actually reduces security. The flip side also holds, right? If I want to, I don't want anybody messing with this algorithm because I'm going to make it an agent that does something really, really important. So I'm not going to I'm going to let it learn and move, and I'm not going to have an ability to reset it. Well, it's secure, but it's not safe, right? And so then that comes down to trusting the actual education, the curriculum, the data, right? And, we've got a system as human decision makers that we absorb a lot of mistake, right? And so algorithms are not going to be perfect, right? But they're going to go at a speed, scale, and scope that when they make mistakes, it could have reverberating and bigger impact, right? Even though that thing is scaped or is scoped, right, in this thing. So the trust issue, again, comes down to roles and responsibilities, right? So if I have an accounting agent, so you asked about, the shift in labor, right? Like, accountancy is going away, right? There's no career for accountants, right? I mean, it's very rote, easily transferable to an algorithmic agent, and I'm going to be able to keep the books, right, and check all the numbers and not make the projections and everything else that's associated with that. I can have, that seems like so if they make a mistake, it may cost me some money, right? But so I may be willing to trust that to become the decision maker. And that's what I mean by the conditionality. So you've put your finger on one of the conditionalities, right? It's trust, right? But what do you need to trust, right? So when you go in and get that doctor's opinion, right? Have you actually researched how many articles they've read, how many, right? Do we tend to really interrogate our doctors? I don't know, we tend to trust them, right? There's just something, we trust that they've been educated, that they're going to make good decisions, et cetera. We may inquire a little bit, but boy, there's a big level of trust that gets transferred to that doctor, right? What is it mentally going to be for me to trust the one that's actually got more experience, has read more, and has got better data, right, to base the diagnostic on, even though that's not a human, right? Am I going to trust that algorithm? The rote processing is really the key to where the first disconnection of labor force is going to come from. So interestingly, to the supposition about digital, sort of a digital divide and income inequality, there's going to be a lot of white-collar jobs that go away, right? A lot of processing capacity in that stream of our economy that goes away because robotic automation tied to the algorithm is a little bit off. They're getting better, right? In fact, some of them are just amazing. But in fact, sort of labor in a manual context are jobs that will go away not as soon as your rote processing jobs. So there's going to be some interesting, it's not going to be just sort of a natural flow of haves, have-nots. There's going to be an interesting mix in all of that. And let's end with the best scenario, right? What a nice question, right, to ask, right? So what's the best scenario in all of this? I would say it's a combination, and you asked sort of the state. I heard three things come out: state, market, and individual, right? We're all going to have to, those three elements are going to be really, really important. And what the state can do is slow this down, right? So there's this interesting letter that, it's signed by AI specialists and a whole bunch of people, including Elon Musk, right, that said, like, let's take a pause on these natural language programs right now, right, ChatGPT. 6 months, let's hold off, and let's have a conversation about this, right? That's not going to, the problem with that is that Elon Musk signed that, and then he also invested in a new natural language programming company that he's going to try to accelerate. Now, do you think he's just going to sit on the sideline when everybody else is sitting on the sideline? So the market's not going to figure that out, right? So I don't know how the state imposes a slowdown, but there needs to be some structuring of slowdown, right? But the real solution set is going to be coming from you all, right, in how you manage this tech, because you're birthing it, right? The data that you're feeding every day on your apps, right, is what's driving this. And it's super convenient, and it's customized down to you individually, right? And when you download that app and you have the terms of agreement, which none of you read, right? And you've just given access to all of your contacts on that digital device to a third party that you have no idea who and where they are, right? Boy, it's really hard. What are you going to do? Right? So I came to Vienna and I made a promise to myself that I was not going to use GPS. Right? Hadn't been here in 6 years. But the good thing about an imperial city is it doesn't really change that much, right? Like big buildings, roads sort of stay the same, right? So I knew my way around, knew my pathway. And there were a couple times where I almost went there, right? But I got 2 days left and I haven't used it, right? So you can make certain choices, right? And we're going to have to actually get to that kind of reflective and understand that maybe I don't need, all of that information flowing in a certain direction. But you know what? At the individual level, that's not gonna help. So for those of us that are in democracies that can actually talk to your representatives, you got to actually get democracy working on this, right? And it can't be the theater that occurred in the U.S. Over TikTok. We can talk about TikTok later. Get it off your phones. But that's a whole other story, right? But that was political theater. But at least they're talking about an understanding that there may be a tipping point where some technology is actually about influence and intelligence gathering and not just entertainment, right? So my best case scenario is that 5 years from now, professor invites me back, and there's been a conversation that started. Look at GDPR, right? I mean, it pulled back a little bit of digital privacy, right, across Europe. And things didn't fall apart, right? Companies didn't go out of business. The United States, we decided not going to monetize medical data. So we have this thing called HIPAA. Most Americans have no idea what it is. It's just a piece of paper that you're signing, right? But what it was it took medical data, your personal data, and said it can't be monetized. That was the purpose. Very moderate regulation in a liberal democratic free market economy. Medical system, yeah, it added some cost, but we haven't monetized, right? So the state actually came in and could do something to help individual privacy. Interesting thing, right? Sort of basic democratic processing. Difficult to do in a populist world, right? But I think that's my best case scenario, right? Is that we actually get to a more normalized, functioning, very light touch regulatory environment in which the state actually becomes the intervening variable for individual privacy and individual agency. And so we can then have that ability to choose what I'm going to have sit next to me. That advisor, that chauffeur, right? Or that medical intervention, that I don't have to go to the gym anymore, right? Workout thing, because they're just working my calories right as I finish this talk, right? So a combination of the state playing its role, the market readjusting to that, and individuals actually asking for agency to stay in their hands.
Yeah, no, Richard, thanks a lot. I think we can definitely... We can definitely give you a big round of applause. For me personally, the slide that I found the most interesting was the loop. But it's actually, if one thinks through it, it's very complicated because so there are already, but even more, so there will be very, very different kinds of algorithms, yeah? And different kind of people will be very differently situated on that loop. Some completely non-digital and some very, very digital. And that's probably going to make the interaction probably quite complicated. And in terms of your questions, so yes, there was a lot on how to link technology and agency, and then there was also some on linking technology, agency, and order, yeah, to some extent, international order. And that we had here in January this conference in the UN, and there was Aman Abgil was here, so the tech envoy, And really, if you're interested in these kinds of things, so with the 2020-40 Summit of the Future, there will be this negotiation of the Digital Global Compact. And just to highlight something that Richard said, I mean, this really for you as a generation, that's probably going to be quite important, the kind of rules and regulations that are going to be made, and these rules and regulations are really very badly needed internationally. Yeah? So in domestic politics alone, it won't be enough. And if you're interested in contributing to that, there's really, so you just have to go to the web page, basically have a couple of good ideas and submit them. So any one of you is interested in doing that, go for it. For the time being, thanks to the Austrian Research Association, we're going to have a little reception over there, and we can continue the discussion there. And perhaps once more, Richard, thanks so much.